Bismillah Rahman Rahim. Welcome to the show, Danish TV. Today, our co-host or the host is Professor Abdul Jabbar, who is Pakistani American professor based in US, and our guest will be Professor Farid Senzai, who is an Afghan American professor based in USA. So the topic is the current situation in Afghanistan and the way forward. Professor Abdul Jabbar, welcome. And I would request you to call the guest and please have a dialogue.
Thank you, Shahid Bhai. It is my pleasure to welcome to our show, our educational program, Dr. Farid Senzai. By way of an introduction, I will tell you a few things which will make you believe that he is the most qualified person to talk about this situation in Afghanistan and the way forward. He originally is from Afghanistan, but that is really not the qualification I have in mind. The qualifications that he has can be listed very briefly. I will just go over those. He's the founder and president emeritus at the Center for Global Policy. It is a think tank based in Washington, D.C. It focuses on improving US relations with the Muslim world. Very important job. He is also an associate professor of political science at Santa Clara University, where he teaches courses on US foreign policy and Middle East politics. Dr. Senzai was previously the co founder and the director of research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. Now, this is an organization dedicated to conducting extensive research on American Muslims. He was also a research associate at the Brookings Institution and a research analyst at the Council on Foreign Relations. Dr. Senzai is on the board of advisors at the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life. He is also a board member at the Central Asia Institute. His first book was Educating the Muslims of America, published by Oxford University Press in 2009. His most recent book is Political Islam in the Age of Democratization, and it's published by Belgrave, 2013. Dr. Senzai received his MA in International Affairs from Columbia University here in the US, and he got his PhD in Politics and International Relations from Oxford University in England. So, once again, a warm welcome to you. I may address you as Farid, is your first name, because we have known each other a long time.
Absolutely.
I am really happy to see you and benefit from your vast knowledge, experiential and academic, of your native country. So maybe we can start with some background information. Our focus will be, of course, on the current situation and the way forward, but it will be good for us to know how we got where we are, how Afghanistan came to be in a situation where it is right now. So maybe we can start with that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor. It really is a pleasure to be with you. We've known each other, as you mentioned, for many years, and this is a topic which is dear and personal to me. It's one that I've been dealing with for many years, but of course, in particular, what's happened lately, especially in the last month, as we see the chain of events that have transpired in the country. Afghanistan is in many ways central to a broad region. It sits physically at the outskirts of what's referred to as the Middle East, Central Asia, and then, of course, South Asia. And because of its centrality, historically, it's always been very important at the crossroads and the trade routes, going all the way back to the Six Silk Roads, going through and the trade routes there. But also, since then, you see major empires that have continued to have interest and attempting to invade or conquer this country of Afghanistan. The history, of course, as many of people highlight, the graveyard of empires, as sometimes it's referred to, where empires have attempted to colonize or subjugate the Afghan people, and they have failed. And so the history suggests that over the centuries, despite efforts by outsiders to colonize Afghanistan, it has not succeeded. And so, of course, the British had tried in the 1840s over several attempts. The Soviet Union during the Cold War, of course, invaded at the end of 1979, in December of 79, and they stayed for 10 years. And that also failed. And so the US's attempt after the Civil War in 1992, you saw that the US started to initially be engaged, but came in much more forcefully, of course, militarily after the September 11th attack in 2001. And so you see this long history of attempts by many countries trying to assert influence in the country, but it has not gone well for any of these outside forces. So the United States, attempting to do this in the last 20 years, those of us that know the country were saying at the time, both in 2001 and soon after the US's attempts to go into the country after the September 11th attacks, we were arguing and making the point that this is not going to go well. It's very, very likely that the US will face the same predicament as these previous powers have faced in the past. And as we see today, of course, in the last month, 20 years later, in some ways we're back to square one, where the Taliban ruling the country before the US's invasion, and 20 years later, the Taliban are once again back in power.
Historical background, Farid. Many people don't really know much about Afghanistan's nuances. It is a very complex society and very rich in history. But most people living in the West depend on the coverage that is provided us. So I remember that mostly it was only Kabul that was covered in the last 20 years. Afghanistan is not just Kabul, so 70% of Afghanistan's population is rural. So what was going on there really was not covered, and people don't really know much about the complexity and differences, which are very important. I was just reading an article the other day in New Yorker, which you may be familiar with, Farid. It's by Anand Gopal. He went to Afghanistan recently and conducted extensive research in the villages, which were not covered. And he came up with some very shocking revelations, which he himself didn't know. He's a reporter also, and he's a professor at Arizona State University, an academic. And so the drawbacks are that we miss the nuances. So perhaps it is very early to say how things will move forward, but you have given us a very helpful background information how we got here. Now, this article also mentions something I would like your comment on, Farid. It says that he went to the villages and talked to women in particular. And the article is called The Other Afghan Women. So when he asked them that the US was intending to help human rights, and that was why they were here, to help women get their rights. And the answers that he got were shocking. And I don't think most American public, and maybe even in Pakistan, people may know that. Maybe in Pakistan, people know much more than in the US. So, because a neighbor. So he said that his response, his question was answered. First of all, every family had about at least 12 people killed in the family. That is rural Afghanistan. And each woman he interviewed said, we were afraid to go outside the house because if we didn't know who would come back, because there were roadside bombs. So they were victimized by airstrikes by the US and by roadside explosions planted by the so-called warlords who were given free rein by the US to find the bad guys. The problem was there were no bad guys left. Taliban had been defeated in 2001. Al-Qaeda had fled the country. And so perhaps you could talk about some of the oversights in the media here and how it hurts in the understanding of the complexity.
For that question. I mean, I think it's an excellent question and goes to, in many ways, to the heart of our efforts over the past 20 years. I mean, we have been engaged in this war with primary focus on going after Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, or those that supported the Taliban as we saw it, and consequently it was an attempt to uproot terrorists within the country. But in this broad effort to fight this war on terror, as we refer to it, we overlooked the details and the nuance of what was happening in the country and what continued to happen over the years. And this particular article that you mentioned is really a very important one. That's one that I am aware of. And you know, the author in this article does an excellent job, as you point out, looking at sort of the everyday consequences of this broad war on terror on villages, rural communities across the country, which, as you pointed out correctly, is the majority of the population. You're looking at 70 to 80% of the population lives in these rural parts of the country. And so while on the one hand we were fighting this war on terror and we were contributing in many ways positively to some of the major cities and those that lived in the cities, but it didn't often translate into security for everyday Afghans in these rural communities. And therefore, the threat of drone strikes or bombings that were taking place, roadside bombing and others, indiscriminately, where children and women were dying, and their safety was not ensured. And so within that context, it was very difficult to make the case for, on the one hand, saying that we are attempting to support and address the issues that women faced, in particular, and girls faced, for instance. On the other hand, not being able to provide basic security for many of these women and girls and children. And so that became a difficult proposition, and one that then led to a lot of resentment, and consequently many within these rural areas started to feel real anger against the United States, and then even the central government in Kabul, which had a difficult time providing this type of support to these rural communities. And I think it also goes to the heart of our effort of assuming in many ways, and wrongly assuming, that by supporting the central government in Kabul, that we could in fact get and garner support from the rest of the country. But Afghanistan historically has never been ruled from the center. I mean, anyone who knows about Afghan history, its culture, its people, they're fiercely independent. And they are, and as a tribal society, often based around kinship and local leaders, that's where the loyalty is, and often divided along ethnic and linguistic lines. It's the local leaders that really have to be brought in, and they are the ones that often are the ones that assert their authority over a particular region in the country. And so our effort really should have been decentralizing power and really trying to diffuse power and giving real power to those in the local communities, so that they could then dictate what was best for them, as well as helping them provide security for their own community. Rather than doing that, we really emphasize the central model too much, with the hope that once we establish security in Kabul, that it would from there begin to bring security to the rest of the country, which of course it didn't. And so this particular article that you point out, I think, really does an excellent job of highlighting the nuance of what was happening on the ground in these local communities, and what the local population, and girls and women in particular, because he interviewed women for this article, what they were thinking, and what their view is today, even as things have transpired and the Taliban have come back to power.
Yeah, thank you, Farid. One of the women said, we have a right to life that comes before anything else. And we lost that right during the occupation of Afghanistan, because they were never sure which of their dear ones will be killed next and if they will be safe. So right to life, and they said right to life, right to education, right to work, right to have a public role. This is the dream and burning desire of every Afghan person. And that was really not addressed during the occupations. Whoever occupied Afghanistan, it was not the benefit of the people. It was always their own goals, propagate their imperial policies or whatever. And the US had a wonderful opportunity, to, as you mentioned, to go to the majority of people who were affected, who were suffering. It didn't happen. Now, one other thing that I would like you to talk to us is about the failure of the US government to distinguish between Al-Qaeda and Taliban. And this is really something that was there in the beginning. I remember President Obama, when he was president, he made a distinction between the two, but then it was lost, and at a very, very high price to the US and to the Afghan society. So perhaps you could spend a few minutes just distinguishing between the two, and the presence, which is very menacing, of Al-Qaeda, or even worse, ISIS in Khorasan province. So I think these foreign elements, how they're hurting Afghanistan, how they were separated initially. Taliban were the people who forced these excesses and victimization of people in the beginning, and that's how they rose to power in 1990s. But this failure to distinguish between Al-Qaeda and Taliban, it is universal ignorance, I would say. Could you please distinguish between the two for the
Well,
benefit?
thank you. I mean, it is a really important question. You know, the the attempt of lumping together, as President Bush did soon after September 11th, not only you know, bringing them together, but then this is Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and saying that, you know, we were going to go after the terrorists that had attacked us, but also those that harbor or host these terrorists. And you know, on the face of it, one may say, well, that was the right thing to do because the Taliban were hosting Al-Qaeda. But what we did in the process was made our effort, our broader effort of fighting and uprooting terrorists within the country far more difficult. Because Al-Qaeda, in terms of actual number, was just a few thousand people. Some suggest maybe 2,000 to 3,000 individuals. And so rather than being much more targeted and going directly after Al-Qaeda, what we did was we then lumped them together with the Taliban. And while the Taliban may have been serving as hosts, it was because of a broader relationship. Keep in mind that both Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri had been part of a broader effort that had been fighting against the Soviet Union, alongside many of those that later then joined the Taliban. I mean, the Taliban was a later phenomenon, but during the Soviet occupation, they fought together as part of what President Reagan at the time referred to them as freedom fighters, or the Mujahideen. They fought together. And so this group was one that saw the Al-Qaeda fighters as having helped them and assisted them in this broader war and struggle against the Soviet Union with U.S. support. And so, so that alliance was clearly there. But in our attempt to try to uproot Al-Qaeda for its attack of September 11th, we lumped them together and continued to insist that we would go after the Taliban as well. But it made the problem far worse, and not understanding the motivations of these two groups, because they do have very different motivations. Al-Qaeda is a transnational Islamist and terrorist group, and the Taliban are far more focused on national ambitions. They are Afghan-centric. Their aim and ambitions is really about trying to transform Afghanistan into an Islamic emirate, as they've done, of course, now and declared since the U.S. withdrawal. So that's always been their ambition. They really haven't been focused on broader ambitions beyond that. So they had differences in terms of their long-term ambitions. But also what we did was, by lumping them together, as I said, the problem becomes worse, because now you have a general population in which they are deeply rooted. And even though people initially, I mean, keep in mind that the population of Afghanistan initially welcomed the Taliban. By that I mean that, you know, Afghanistan had been going through a very deep, divisive civil war from 1989 until 1992. And in that war was one in which it broke out into civil war, and therefore stability was needed. The Taliban provided some semblance of security for vast parts of the country. And therefore, initially, by 1995 and 1996, when they captured Kabul and then ruled over 95% of the country, there was initially support for them because they had brought some level of stability. But we saw that there were more draconian measures, and those that were much more extreme against the general population alienated them from the population, and consequently the population then started to resist and fight against them. So part of our aim really should have been about trying to isolate, in fact, separate Al-Qaeda from the Taliban, and made our overall effort much easier. because as I said, the number of Al-Qaeda fighters was much smaller. Plus, even within the Taliban, we could have made distinctions, what I sometimes refer to as Taliban with a capital T versus Taliban that were sympathizers or supporters among the general public. And really, the hardline Taliban leadership that were staunchly or more likely to be supportive of Al-Qaeda, we could have then gone after them without then alienating the vast majority of those that were either supportive or sympathetic to the Taliban among other segments of the population. But we didn't go that route, and consequently, we continued to then not be absolutely clear about what our war aims were and who, in fact, we wished to fight this war against. And the Taliban then continued to, as an insurgency force, continue to fight against us until, and they knew that at some point the United States would depart. And those of us that were analysts and writers on this topic were clear that at some point the United States would be forced to leave, and the Taliban would assert their authority once again, which is precisely where we are today.
Yeah, thank you very much for that information. Very vital to understand the difference between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. As transnational, Al-Qaeda and nationalist focused on Afghanistan, Taliban. Very important. It's very ironic, Farid, that today Taliban are called, they're being called allies of the US. And who is calling them allies of the US and they're hating the Taliban? They are inside Afghanistan and they are ISKP, Khorasan province. So ISIS is another organization, terrorist organization that has emerged as a transnational body, and it has cells all over. I believe that it has cells in Pakistan and in India. So maybe it is a good news for peacemakers that Taliban are seen as allies of the US, because that is the way forward. That the US and Taliban have to negotiate, and the Taliban should be definitely persuaded to be more cognizant of human rights, women's rights, and things like that. But this is not the time to make it a condition. As Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, said, we are moving toward the current situation now because I'm keeping an eye on the time also, so making it a quick transition to the present situation. The Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, said, I just looked at his speech again. He said, to prevent humanitarian crisis, there's only one way to go. We must strengthen and stabilize the current government. But he didn't stop there. He elaborated. He said, that he's being criticized for. My question is to everyone who is criticizing him, what is the option? What options do we have? So then he goes on to say, I'm talking about Imran Khan's speech, if the world community incentivizes giving incentives to the Taliban, the current government, if the world can do that to respect human rights, keep terrorists off their soil, and have an inclusive government, it will be a win-win situation for everyone. That is an important statement coming from someone who is the Prime Minister of Pakistan, a country which is next door to Afghanistan. And Afghanistan and Pakistan's destinies are inextricably linked, because for security in Afghanistan and Pakistan, they depend on each other. And so, as someone who knows people in Afghanistan on a first-hand basis, who has extended family in Afghanistan, I'm sure it's very hard for you to say in a flippant way, yes, let's do that. What kind of hope do you hold for this approach that Imran Khan has suggested? Do you think it is viable, or do you think there is another alternative?
Well, thank you. I mean, it is a important yet difficult question. I mean, one could wish the Taliban away and wish that, Afghanistan had a more moderate government, or one that were in fact respecting human rights and addressing sort of the sensibilities that we in the West have about human rights, women's rights, education for girls, for instance, the way that punishment is enforced, and so on and so forth. Those things are things that we could continue to wish for. But, wish doesn't translate into what's happening on the ground. And the reality is the Taliban are a presence. They are there. They have won this war. It's very difficult for many Americans to accept the fact that we've lost this war. This was a devastating war, 20 years that we fought, and we've lost. And so the reality is the Taliban are there. Nobody wants instability in Afghanistan moving forward. That's the last thing we want. The last thing we need is for Afghanistan to unravel and break out into a civil war. That's not good for anybody. And it's not good for many reasons. Of course, first and foremost is that anytime you have instability and you have a civil war, a vacuum is created. And within that vacuum, as we know, vacuums are then filled by extremist and terrorist groups. And so it would be in the interest of groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, as you mentioned, for the country to divulge and fall back into its past and in a civil war, because that's when they would then start to take root and continue to assert themselves. Part of these, even the terrorist attacks that took place at the airport right around the time when the U.S. Withdrew, and 170 civilians, Afghan civilians, and 13 U.S. military officials that were killed in that attack, was an attempt to destabilize the country at this very, very difficult and precarious time that Afghanistan's going through. And so the last thing we want is for those kinds of attacks to continue to take place in major cities and across the country, because that will, as I said, lead to civil war. So if the reality is that we can't really wish the Taliban away, the reality is, what do we do when they're there? I think, Imran Khan's speech received a lot of criticism because of it was seen as being too sympathetic to the Taliban. But the reality is, it's really about saying, how do we deal with the Taliban now that they are in power? I think that finding some sequential way to incentivize, as he pointed out, is appropriate, so that we currently don't have any other leverage. And so if we use, whether it's humanitarian assistance or financial aid or any other type of leverage that we have, including, of course, international recognition, which is what they seek, if we sequentially bring these in and conditionally bring these in with the understanding that they will moderate some of their views. I mean, on the one hand, one may say that, they are the same Taliban that was in power from 1996 to 2001. The reality is that's not the case, that in some regards, they will continue to enforce very draconian measures and assert themselves in the way that they did in the 1990s. But they also understand the mistakes that they made then. You were looking at many of these individuals that were in their late 20s and early 30s. They didn't really know how to govern. They still don't know how to govern, but the point is that they have learned lessons from that experience, and they know that in order to get international recognition, they really do have to change and moderate some of their positions. And so on the issue of girls' education, it's clear that they have not opened up schools, as we see, for secondary schools for girls. There is suggestion that they are doing that or plan to do that. We will see, but in some ways we will have to see if their actions match their words. The same applies then with the government that they are trying to assemble. Initially, of course, those that were part of the government were all Taliban leaders and all from the Pashtun ethnic community in the country. They have since then started to expand, and then just recently they've added an additional 50 to 60 individuals that are outside of the Taliban, which is their attempt to say that we are opening things up. But, you know, once again, no women are part of that government. And so part of it is for us to be critical, for us to push where we can, but also realize the reality of what is there. And as I said, you know, humanitarian assistance is absolutely essential. And so in some ways, we don't want the country to also starve. We don't want, especially with the winter coming up, you know, there was a recent statistic that 93% of Afghans are not going to have enough to eat in the coming months. I mean, that's a really devastating and painful statistic to hear. And so for us to just sort of walk away and say that we're not going to support the country financially or with humanitarian assistance until they completely transform themselves, that's really wishful thinking, and that will only lead to further alienation, unnecessary and innocent lives being lost, and then in the long term, resentment from the general public. And so it's really about looking at the reality of what's happening in the country and trying to deal with that reality rather than trying to somehow conjure up and wish for or dream of an Afghanistan that we would like in our image and the kind of the system that we would wish for. Well, that's not the reality, and I think, you know, facing that reality is absolutely imperative for us moving forward.
Yeah, thank you, Farid. One problem that the international community has in insisting on human rights, making that a condition. The problem is that we are dealing with double standards. As you and I talked yesterday about this issue, in Saudi Arabia, amputations are carried out. It is very similar to what the Taliban have been following. Now, we don't criticize Saudi Arabia. We don't make anything conditional. Everyone in the world, every country has deep ties with, economic ties with Saudi Arabia. Now, in this critical situation where lives are at stake in Afghanistan, to make stipulations of that nature that the money will be given to Taliban only if they adopt some Western imposed conditions. That is very unfair, I would say, and I agree with you that it should be the focus to avert, you know, this crisis that is looming, and just leave aside too many conditions, because Taliban are not going to accept conditional assistance. The foreign minister of Taliban, I saw him on Al Jazeera, he said that we will be extremely happy to receive any humanitarian assistance, but if any assistance is given to us with any strings attached, with conditions, they won't accept. Putin, of all the people, a veteran of the invasion of Afghanistan, he made a very interesting statement right after Taliban took over. He said, we in the West have to shed our arrogance that we can and have the right to impose our values on another culture. I don't think he says Russia has learned a lot from its experience, but I think that is very true. At this time we should be just focused on averting the crisis. And as you mentioned, Reed, if the chaos rules again in Afghanistan, who will benefit? Only the warlords will come back again, take over, and do indiscriminate killings. Nobody will benefit. So I would like to share with you. Just I was thinking, you are a person of peace. I have always noticed that you are not interested in um, your side of the argument only. You want to understand the situation and bring about a rapprochement, which is some very idealistic goal. So I would like to compare your words and your position with another very. This one is an iconic person in American history, Dr. Martin Luther King. When the U.S. was involved with the Vietnam War, the war was going on, and he pleaded for peace. And his argument was very interesting. And I think it will be a motto for the world to follow. Unfortunately, it is not followed. This is what he said. This I believe to be the privilege and the burden of all of us who deem ourselves bound by allegiances and loyalties which are broader and deeper than nationalism and which go beyond our nation's self-defined goals and positions. We are called to speak for the weak, for the voiceless, for the victims of our nation, and for those our nation calls enemy. For no document from human hands can make these humans any less our brothers. That is Dr. Martin Luther King. And then he finishes, he says, I speak not for the soldiers of each side, not of the ideologies, but simply of the people who have been living under the curse of war for almost 3 continuous decades now. I think of them too because it is clear to me that there will be no meaningful solution until some attempt is made to know them and hear their broken cries. So I just happened to read one of your messages. I think it was a tweet in which you mentioned the tragedy is that the West has never understood Afghan people, its history and culture. So maybe we can conclude with your comment on that. You think there is more hope of our understanding the Afghan culture, history, and the situation now, or it is the same as it was 20 years ago?
Well, it really is. It's a difficult situation. Obviously, we all understand that. But I, by nature, am a hopeful person. I don't. On the one hand, there's times when I do get upset and feel like I'm losing hope. But we have to remain hopeful. We have to remain hopeful. 40 years is a very long time for a country to be at war. But yet, despite that, we have to remain hopeful that there is a positive outcome that's going to come for Afghanistan. It's really about how we move forward. I think the United States really needs to, as you pointed out, needs to reflect in terms of how we engaged in this country. If President Putin can say what he did, having said that the Soviets and Russia learned from their experience in Afghanistan, I think it really is a time for the United States to reflect on what happened, not only what we did in Afghanistan. Things we did right, but then also things that we did wrong. And what were the mistakes? What are the lessons from our experience over the past 20 years? I think it really is a time for us to self-reflect in that way. It also is about our broader role as a country in terms of our role globally as to the role that we played. So I think Afghanistan can be part of that self-reflection for us to think about what role does the United States want to play moving forward. I mean, we're a major power. We are the superpower still, but yet we really have to know and understand what is the best way to engage with the rest of the world. Now, in terms of Afghanistan, I think that it is one in which knowing the history, knowing the culture, knowing the people is absolutely necessary. We went into the country without truly understanding this, or at least overlooking some of the nuance that was there, that is there. Sometimes painting this broad brush across the country and having a very myopic view of the reality of what was happening on the ground. And so we didn't fully understand what we were engaged in and what we were doing, or the people that we were dealing with. And so that really came back to haunt us. So I think that part of it is really peeling away and trying to understand what is taking place and what has been taking place in the country. Part of that, of course, is knowing the culture, knowing the people. That requires for the United States to approach Afghanistan, as well as its role more broadly, with some level of humility. It requires humility for us to understand that we can't just fix things just because we want to. And we certainly can't fix things militarily. I mean, that was always the major lesson in Afghanistan, that the military strategy and option wasn't going to result in a peaceful outcome. It really had to be a political solution. And we didn't put enough emphasis on that political effort to try to understand the dynamic of what was happening on the ground and really try to bring the various sides together, including the Taliban from the very outset, because we would have had far more leverage in 2001, 2002, if we had, in fact, rather than lumping them together with Al-Qaeda, really truly used and helped them be part of the solution at a time when we had far more leverage. But we know that our leverage continued to wane over the years. And in the last 3, 4, 5 years, we really had very little to no leverage left. All of it had been dwindled and dissipated. And so at the end, when we started to negotiate with the Taliban, it was too late, because the Taliban had all the leverage. And that's why they were in many ways able to dictate the terms of what President Trump at the time negotiated and agreed to, which was essentially don't attack us and try to make sure that terrorist activities is not taking root in the country, and we will withdraw. And so the reality was that Afghanistan was going to fall into the hands of the Taliban eventually. This was a reality that we all understood for several years. It isn't something that should have been a surprise. Everyone understood that the Taliban had the momentum on their side and that they were gaining territory, districts, and provinces all across the country. And therefore, they were going to come back to power. But by then, we had no leverage. So now the question is, how do we engage with the country? We really, once again, have to engage with the reality of what's taking place, understanding the situation and the circumstances that Afghanistan faced. Really listen to what Afghan people are saying across the country, those that are sympathetic and supportive of the Taliban, as well as those that are adamantly and critically, in many ways rightfully so, against the Taliban. And so trying to bring these different sides together requires us to approach Afghanistan, as I've always said, with a certain level of humility. If that's one lesson that we can take away from Afghanistan, I think it will be a lesson that will be very worthwhile. It will be one that will serve us well in the long term in terms of understanding these situations in these other countries and how we engage with them. I think for Afghanistan, it will be a hopeful outcome in the long term, where they are able to dictate and decide what is best for them, in allowing for all the different sides, all the different factions in the country to come together, all the ethnic, linguistic makeup that makes Afghanistan what it is to come together. So I hope that is something that we support, and something we take a very strong stand in trying to support, as well as other countries that can help us in that effort. If that happens, then I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful for a brighter future for the country.
Continue this conversation for much longer time, and we will have to have a part 2 to this discussion, because there are a lot of questions that still need to be answered. But I like your cautious optimism, which is not just surface, but based on analysis. So on that note, I would like to thank you again for this very enlightening discussion about Afghanistan. And I look forward to another session with you in the future. We will set it up, mutual availability is always there.
Thank you so much.
Once again, and if anybody has any question in the audience, they can post them on YouTube. The link will be there, and then we can always answer, not immediately, but whenever we catch a question, we'll be happy to answer. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Professor Senzai. Thank you, Shahid Awan Sahab, and Khuda Hafiz.
Khuda Hafiz. Thank you so much.